Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm Callie Waterhouse with the Arizona Association of Realtors, and we are thrilled to welcome you to today's webinar with Patrick Ritchie. And today we're going to be talking about demystifying the credit score. And as realtors, we all know that this is one of those touchy subjects that sometimes it's a fragile conversation to have. But this is a good information. This is a good source of the source that you want to be aware of the conversation ahead of time and be proactive. So we'd like to welcome Patrick Ritchie, who is a senior loan officer at Caliber Home Loans. He is also one of our GRI finance instructors, and he wrote the book, The Credit Roadmap. Patrick is a graduate of Arizona State University Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law and the Ohio State University Fisher College of Business. He's been in the mortgage industry for about 16 years and lives in Chandler with his family. And if you have been part of our GRI program or if you've been around for a while, I'm pretty sure that you have either know Patrick or have come across his name because he is definitely our go-to guy for all things finance. So welcome, Patrick.
One thing I want to talk about, and this comes up a lot in the GRI finance class, agents will ask, how can I make sure that the lender is doing what they need to be doing as early on in the process as possible? Which, when I think about it in all the different classes and all the different scenarios that we talk about in that GRI finance class, there's one question that I think really needs to be asked early, whether you're the listing agent or the buyer's agent. And that question is going to be...
On your screen, you're going to see the very first poll question for today. And it says, do you currently ask your lender when the credit report expires? This is kind of an important question to start the conversation.
I think it is. In a lot of different ways, the pre-qualification form tells you where that borrower is. And you want to know that, of course, if you're the buyer's agent, before you put them in the car and write a contract. But as a listing agent, you might be deciding between multiple offers, and you want to get the best one, but you also want the one that's going to close. And so by asking the lender, as limited as somebody might be in terms of what they can ask the lender under privacy policy issues, asking to make sure that that credit report does not expire before the end of your transaction. If you're going to expire on 5 days before you're actually going to close and a brand new credit report has to be pulled, that can be problematic because you don't know what's going to be on that new credit report. And so when I ask agents, are you asking about the expiration of the credit report, I would say maybe 1% of the people who have been in my class, I've been asking that question now for just over 12 months, maybe 1% are actually asking that question. But based on hindsight being 2020, the scenarios that I hear people saying, this is what happened, this is where my transaction went wrong, and you don't always know the full story, of course, but by asking that question, when does that credit report expire, and making sure that it's good through your close of escrow, that's a good starting point. Because what if the lender says, oh, I don't know when it expires? Now you kind of have a good idea of what you're dealing with. If anything, the squeaky wheel always gets the oil, and so now maybe you have retuned the lender's view of what they need to do on that file to make sure, oh yeah, that's a good question. I never had thought about that. Although most lenders have probably thought about that. So I think it's a great question to be asking. And definitely something that moving forward, I think can kind of help you gauge what you're dealing with, but also it's one of those very, very simple things that, if asked early, can make sure that you're on track. So that's...
Well, it looks like based on today's participants, about 58% say no, that they haven't asked, but I bet 100% will start asking tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Wonderful. So the most important question?
So the most important question, when does the credit report expire? When does the credit report expire? Now, the lender's still going to do a soft pull at the end to make sure that there's no new inquiries. So, in part of that do not do list, something that we want to make sure that we review. Even with the smartest of clients, everybody can make mistakes or say, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to do that. One of the things that we definitely have to put in their mind is to not apply for credit, to not apply for things that are absolutely unnecessary when they're trying to get a mortgage. Applying for mortgages, that's fine. That's the whole objective. But they should not be buying a car. They should not be co-signing on vehicles. They should not be signing leases on apartments with friends, family, children. All of these things. The stories are endless. They should, once the lender says that they are approved, they should essentially live in a kind of like a fishbowl and not get out of their fishbowl. Stay in the bowl, keep things exactly the way they are when the lender has actually looked at them. And it's not just the credit, it's of course the assets, whatever the assets were when they were pre-approved. They want to make sure that those aren't going to be changing, lending it out to their nephew in another state under the assumption that it's going to be paid back before closing. Everything has to be documented. And so definitely, when you're reviewing the do not do, like don't quit your job, don't switch your job, we're a community property state, so don't get married during the transaction unless everybody's aware of this happening. All these things, but definitely when it comes to credit, making sure that they're not out there applying for something, oh, I just wanted to save 10%. Sometimes a buyer gets really excited about moving into their new home, of course, and they see this sale at the home improvement store where the appliances are marked down and they can get another 10% off if they get the credit card. Well, that's fine, but the bigger picture, most important thing is to get this closed, funded, and recorded without any issue. And for most people, their credit is good enough to where something like that probably is not going to be that much of an impact. But for some people, it does make a difference because you can kind of tier it out in terms of the approval, getting approved. So maybe I get approved, but maybe my credit were to drop a little bit to where now I'm not getting the rate that I had hoped that I was going to get. Or on a conventional loan, it's not just the interest rate that's affected by the FICO score, but also the mortgage insurance. That can make a big difference. And a lot of times people don't think about the impact on a conventional mortgage that it's going to have on what they're actually going to pay for the mortgage insurance. On FHA, it's the same regardless of what their FICO score is. But when it comes to conventional, they will actually pay more based on what their credit score is. If their credit score is lower, they're going to pay more. If it's higher, they're going to pay less. So there's definitely a reward if they have a higher FICO score. Kind of the line in the sand is if somebody falls under 680, it is definitely the wrong side of the tracks when it comes to mortgages, because on a conventional loan, well, it may be fine on FHA and VA and all that. On a conventional loan, if they're going to have private mortgage insurance and they're at, say, 679 versus a counterpart who's at 681, you've got two different mortgage insurance policies. The person at the 679 is going to pay more versus the person at 681. And so little things like that begin to add up. And especially falling under 680, there's an impact on the interest rate that's not as significant as what you would see on the actual private mortgage insurance. So that's kind of one of those little behind-the-scenes type things. So how long is the credit report good for? It's good for 120 days. So from when that lender has pulled that credit report, you've got 120 days before a new credit report needs to be pulled. So the question you need to ask yourself is, how far into this process with the lender is my client? If they've been, how many of you have ever had somebody who's 90 days into looking at properties and then finally they find that perfect one, and let's say now it's the 91st day, you write a 30-day contract and you've only got a credit report that's maybe good for another 29 days. That means on that final day when you're getting ready to close, you might have this funding condition of, oh, we got to pull a new credit report. And while probably 9 times out of 10, it doesn't matter, it doesn't affect anything, knowing that even that there's a 10% chance of it affecting something, you would make sure that that is taken care of early so that it's not happening at the end. And this is one of the things I hear a lot in the GRI finance class is why do denials happen at the end so often? Why couldn't they have happened earlier? Why couldn't it have been caught earlier? Well, and that's where we can be proactive by asking those questions, such as, hey, is this good through the close of escrow? That, I think the most important thing is being proactive, asking the questions that you can ask and you can get answers to, And all those little things start to add up in terms of hopefully a very smooth, stress-free transaction.
So Patrick, are those 120 days, are those business days, or is that every day, holidays and weekends included?
That's every day, all calendar days.
Okay. Yep. Okay, so that's good to know. So that's kind of like the something to put on the calendar of things to watch. We have that timeline that everybody uses.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Because as long as you know that you're good on that end, we still need to make sure that they're not applying for something that is unnecessary. We really want to avoid those inquiries. The other thing that people don't realize is under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, there's a thing called permissible purpose. So one of the questions I ask of my clients is, here's what's on your credit report. Is there anything out there, such as a collection per se, that is out there that you're familiar with that we're not seeing here on the credit report? Because what some smart collectors will do is they'll just wait until somebody has that mortgage inquiry, because they have the legal right to check somebody's credit report. They might actually be set up on some sort of a trigger so that when that inquiry comes through, that they're made aware of this, because there is a credit relationship between a debtor and a collector. So they have the whole permissible purpose required by the Fair Credit Reporting Act. So that mortgage inquiry could be the trigger of a collection to come. Now, for a lot of people, that's not going to be the case, but it can happen. And I've seen people go from being at 680, maybe they're using like the Home in 5 program that we have here in Maricopa County, or some of the other down payment assistance programs that are in other counties, and they may have a collection that shows up that drops their credit score 80 points. That is a possibility. It's just not a absolute common thing, but when it's your transaction, it feels pretty common at that point in time. So you just don't want it to happen to your transaction. And then you get into loan programs like the jumbo loan programs. Maybe somebody with a jumbo loan program, if they might have a really good score, but even dropping down to what is still a good score, it could make a difference in terms of what their interest rate is going to be. So all these little things do begin to add up. But that's the main thing, is know that it's good for 120 days, and ask the lender, just in case that lender maybe they say 90 days, but in general it's 120 days. But a good question to ask. It's a great engagement question at the beginning to make sure that the lender is doing what they're supposed to be doing. That's the most important thing.
So this is a good question to ask. It's not like one of those questions that they're going to get mad if you ask the question.
Yeah, they really shouldn't get mad. And just to kind of give you the questions, if I don't have a real estate license, but knowing what I know, I would ask, number one, when does that credit report expire? I would ask, have you run this through automated underwriting? I would ask, have you reviewed the credit report to make sure that there's no disputes that would void the automated underwriting? And perhaps that's another webinar topic for another day.
That's what I'm thinking.
But there's these, and actually we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on. But I would ask those questions. And if you're not familiar with the acronym CAVERS, it stands for Credit Alert Interactive Voice Response System, and that's in the HUD portal, where on an FHA loan, a VA loan, a USD rural housing loan, a borrower, you have to make sure, the lender has to make sure that borrower hasn't had a federal claim against them in the past 3 years. If they're in that CAVERS database, they are not eligible for 3 years from the date that a federal claim was paid on their behalf. So if they defaulted on government-backed student loans, defaulted on a previous FHA loan, whether it was a foreclosure or a short sale, I very rarely see VA report to CAVERS. Social Security overpayments could potentially go in there. I don't see that too often, but there's these possibilities. It could be a small business administration issue, but if somebody's in that database, and it's not like as a consumer I can just go check that database, the lender actually will check that database, got to log in, have your login and password, you put in the borrower's Social Security number, their name, and it comes up clear or not clear. So every once in a while, somebody will describe something in the GRI finance class where they'll say, yeah, the lender said that they're just not eligible for 3 more months. It has nothing to do with a foreclosure or a short sale. It's something that they're using FHA. And usually that means that CAVERS wasn't checked at the beginning. So if I was an agent, I would ask, if it was a government finance transaction, I would ask, have you checked CAVERS? Now, once again, it's a question of engagement. I'm having conversation with the lender. I'm seeing how familiar they are with the actual file. Have they actually done these little steps that we know that come together to make, if they're done, hopefully an easy transaction throughout the process. If they say, well, what's Cavers? You got bigger issues to worry about. and sometimes that happens. So little things happen. In that Cavers issue, that's not even anything that has anything to do with conventional. That's just government. That's just FHA, VA, and USDA rural housing. So I think those questions do matter, because as a lender, there are sometimes, there are times where listing agents do ask questions, but very rarely are they asking these types of questions, very rarely. And I would definitely encourage those questions, because I think, if you've ever had frustration with a real estate transaction, and that's usually our way for everybody to stop laughing in a live class in front of an audience, if you've ever had that frustration, all the things that we possibly can do to make it less stressful, we need to do. So these are the things that you should add to your checklist of, hey, I want to make sure I've asked this question, so that at least I'm planting the seed that I care about this stuff, that I'm watching this stuff, that I'm familiar with the importance of this stuff. So I think that's the main ingredient there. So let's talk about the real credit score. So many times I will have a client say, oh, I check my credit all of the time. Well, there's only one score that we use in mortgage lending that we care about, and it's been around since the end of 1994, beginning of 1995, and that is the FICO score. So the FICO score, there's many versions of it. The main one that we really tend to care about is the FICO Classic model, and it's always open for change, but generally we want that FICO Classic model. That's the score that's most common in the mortgage industry. When somebody signs up with some of those, get your free credit score here type websites, they're not generally getting the FICO score, although the FICO score is more available today than it ever has been. Some credit cards are offering it, to their credit card holders. It's out there. People can go straight to myfico.com and they can actually get a copy of their credit report and their FICO score, although it's not free. Free is always attractive, and you get what you pay for. And sometimes you get something for free, and it's like it's a 100% money-back guarantee. You'll get all that free back when you're not satisfied with the credit score that's being provided. And so the issue is you get into unfair business practices. If I just mirror FICO's credit score and I give that out for free to consumers, Fair Isaac is going to sue, and they're going to come after whoever's doing that. And they've been very, very aggressive legally in protecting what they feel is imperative to their business and their right. And they're constantly in fights with the credit bureaus. And so you got to really be careful in terms of what you're giving out as a credit score, because Fair Isaac is watching. They go by pretty much FICO these days. And there's all sorts of litigation in the past where they've battled. And so that's kind of where that set the stage for what has become a generic credit score. When a consumer asks for a credit score, they're assuming, if I ask for my credit score from you, if I say, hey, what's my credit score? I'm going to assume you're going to give me a credit score that is what a lender would use, because otherwise I probably don't really care about my credit score, because outside of that, most people, except for those ultra competitive people who just want to win on every level at everything in life, most people just really don't care about what their credit score is, except for when they want something. We need credit when there's opportunity, or when we're trying to make payroll and we're surviving and we need to get a credit line to make sure that happens until revenue comes in, whatever the case may be. But it's generally opportunity, such as buying a house or buying a business, or survival, and then there's everything in between. There's a saying, the easiest time to get a loan is when you don't need it. And it's absolutely true. When you do not need it, it is the easiest time to get it. When you absolutely need it, it may actually be the most difficult time. So it's better to kind of lay things out early, and that's the important thing, is for people to realize it's the FICO score, not just any free credit score that they might get. I have people, and I won't name the websites individually, but you see the commercials, they're out there. You know exactly the websites I'm talking about. Sometimes they're close on what the FICO score actually is, and a lot of times they're not. Sometimes they might be 50 points off. I've seen them as far as 100 points. Very rarely, not recently, they've been off as much as 150 points. But here's something that people have to know. This past December, I had a client I was working with. We're trying to get the score up just a little bit more because it was going to make a difference on what their interest rate was going to be. And so they were close. I'm telling them what to do. Instead of me pulling it, I wanted them to go to one of those websites and have them monitor it on their own. so that I knew once it's updated on their end, I could go ahead and pull it, because it's going to be a hard inquiry. When I pull it, I want to go ahead and make sure that we've got what we need so we see what the new FICO score is. So they say, hey, it's finally reporting, it's updated, let's go for it. But something weird, then they said, but something weird showed up. The score actually went up really high on what I'm seeing on this website, but I noticed that it's saying I don't have any public records anymore. Well, they had a bankruptcy, they had a foreclosure, and while time had passed and those things heal, the credit report that they got from probably the most commonly advertised free credit score place that I see out there, they said, congratulations, you have no public records, which was not true. They had the bankruptcy, they had the foreclosure, so they're now seeing a score that's not only not really going to be mimicking the FICO score turn by turn, but now they've taken out the consideration of this foreclosure, they've taken out the consideration of this bankruptcy. Now the foreclosure is really just it's an account type. It's how did this account end? It's not generally under the public records section. It would just be under that mortgage trade line. Bankruptcy is a different story. That's going to be there. It's going to show on the credit report for 10 years, but it's going to be in the bankruptcy court system for eternity. It's not going to just go away. What's recorded with a trustee sale for a foreclosure, that's going to be on the county recorder's website in whatever county it happened. It's not going away. And so I just found it interesting what consumers are being told and then what reality is. So if somebody was really truly trusting in that, I mean, they know that event happened, but they think some miraculous deletion occurred and now it's no longer there. Well, it ultimately, if it wasn't there and it had happened, it's going to be discovered at some point in time. So it's better to know these things up front. Every once in a while, I'll have somebody where they've just frivolously disputed things and they've gotten things removed off their credit report, but that stuff still will come up. If it's not on the credit report, there's other things where it's going to come up. So it's better to know the whole story right off the bat. I tend to just kind of do a quick check of the court systems, quick check of the county recorder, just to make sure that there's nothing that should have actually been on that credit report that's absent from it. But I think it's a really important thing for people to know that what they're getting may not actually contain everything that is true. So our goal is going to be 740 and higher for the FICO score. If we can get to 740 or higher, it generally is always going to give us the best terms regarding what our interest rate is going to be. If we're paying private mortgage insurance on conventional, I'm probably going to pay the least amount of money. Every once in a while, somebody will do what's called lender paid mortgage insurance, and there, really you get to 800, and that's where you kind of get into the cream of the crop. But most people do the monthly borrower paid mortgage insurance on conventional, and so if somebody can get to 740, then they're fine. And so how high can that FICO score actually go in the classic model? Well, it can go up to about 850. So somebody who's at 841, let's say they're at 841, which I still remember that was the highest FICO score I've seen. I still remember that credit report, and if we have time, I'll tell you how that guy got an 841. There was one very significant reason, and we'll talk about that when we get to the credit scoring breakdown. But somebody at a 740 and somebody at an 841, they're getting the same interest rate on a conventional mortgage. They're getting the same interest rate on VA. They're getting the same interest rate on FHA. Being over 740 on those programs, it's nice. Maybe it helps a little bit with the automated underwriting, but it's not going to get them anything more. Now on jumbo loans, if you've got somebody who's going over the conforming limit of 417, if they're in that jumbo market range, I would say just try to get that FICO score as high as possible, because the tiers in terms of what the rate is going to be are going to go above that 740, and then now somebody who's maybe at 760 would be better off than somebody at 740. Every once in a while you might see it at 780, but generally as a goal, what should I be trying to get for? Get to 740, absolutely. Now let's say that I'm not close to a 740. Let's say you've got a client who's rebuilding and 740 is just out of the question for the time being. But the good news is everybody can be perfect again after 7 years. I mean, the stuff stays on the credit report for 7 years. As time passes, it has less and less impact. Bankruptcy stays on there for 10 years. But I see people go through bankruptcy and foreclosure, and within 2.5 to 3 years, they're back in the low 700s. It doesn't take that long to get back on, to get back on course, as long as they reestablish credit. That's the most important thing. The people who are hurting themselves the most are the ones that don't reestablish credit, because you can't get a good credit score unless you have something positive going in to offset the negative that happened previously. So it's getting less and less important over time as time passes, but you still have to offset it with something positive. So if I don't have any credit at all reporting, I'm just like a ship without a motor, without a sail. I'm just blowing in the wind, and wherever the water takes me, that's where my boat is going to go. So I need to take control and establish something, something. And even if it's just a department store credit card, and this is interesting. I pulled credit on somebody like a chief executive officer at a high-level company who had great credit, didn't even need a mortgage, could have paid cash, wanted to leverage. And I pulled the credit, and I knew it was going to be interesting. These are the types of things I get excited about. I always like to analyze what the credit looks like. But this person we would categorize them in a personal finance class. We would say they've made it. They have enough money to live off of for the rest of their life. They're not ultra rich per se, but they are very, very comfortable. And so I love looking at that credit report to see where they're at. And they actually were in severe danger of their credit going down. And I pointed out to them that they had a very important credit card on their credit report. And I said, I guarantee you don't realize how important this is, but you've had this account for 20 years. You're kind of in a cash type situation now. You use cash for pretty much everything. You don't need credit. You want credit because you want to leverage on this mortgage, but don't let that department store card with the $500 credit limit, don't ever let that get closed due to inactivity, because your credit score is on the back of that department store credit card because of the length of time that you've had it. You're going on 2 decades of having it, and you haven't used it. It looks like 4 years. Go buy a bottle of cologne or perfume or something, because you don't want inactivity to close that down, and then you lose it. Now that 20 years of activity is gone, and your scores are going to go down. They're not going to be bad, but you don't have much credit. And so that's one of the nice things about credit cards. If we can not abuse them in terms of using them when we really shouldn't be using them, if we manage them well, we can harness the power of what their age is. How old are they? The older the credit card, the better, because it's indefinite. It's never going to go away. Back to I mentioned the 841, the guy that had the 841 FICO score. Well, the reason he had an 841 FICO score, he has a credit card that he's had since 1965. If he closes that credit card, he's not going to have an 841. He probably would still have like a 760 or a 780 because he had other credit cards. But if he closed all of his credit cards, eventually his scores would plummet, because he just wouldn't have, there's always some residual there as far as the positive history, but you want it ongoing. You want that month-to-month reporting. If for consumers, they look at their credit reports, and there's, under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, there's a thing called reason codes. Reason codes is about 42 reason codes that are telling you why your score is not perfect. And so I could have a 740 FICO score, be looking at my credit report, and then I'll see 4 comments. One might say too many revolving lines of credit, credit not established, too recent finance company, or the most common one is serious derogatory item, which could be a 30-day late period from 6 years and 11 months ago. That's only got life of 1 more month, because credit, the late payments only stay there for 7 years, and then they drop off. Collections only stay there for 7 years, and then they drop off, assuming that a creditor didn't put them back on and change the date. That's one thing we have to watch for. But if I see that as a consumer, I might feel pretty bad about myself. I might think, holy cow, I've got too many credit cards. I got to close them down. And if that guy that had the 841, if he closed that credit card that he's had since 1965, if he closed that because he saw, oh, you have too many revolving lines of credit or unsecured revolving lines of credit, if he took that to mean he's got too many credit cards and he closed it, the next time he looked at his credit, his score would be lower, and it would say too few revolving lines of credit. So my advice is ignore the reason codes. It's actually a mortgage disclosure that people will get in their mortgage package up front. They'll see it again at closing, and it's going to give them the reason codes. And each credit bureau, Equifax, Expire, and TransUnion, they're each going to have slightly different FICO score, and they maybe have 4 different reason codes of why that score is not perfect. And that's all it's measuring. It's only measuring perfection and why it's not perfect. And the reality is there's no such thing as perfect. it's just not possible. Like every once in a while I'll see a FICO score that's so good where it can't even come up with 4 reasons, it only comes up with 2, but those 2 reasons still make somebody feel pretty bad about themselves. It's kind of like saying, okay, here's the cutest puppy in the world, but tell me why it's not the cutest puppy in the world. Only tell me why it's not the cutest puppy in the world. Like there's something cuter out there. There's no win there. They're never going to pat you on the back and say, good job, you're doing great with your credit. It's only going to sound adversarial. And I've actually had clients in the past call me in tears, say, oh, I read through this form and it sounds horrible. So I generally try to always point it out before they look at it, because it's something that they probably should just ignore ultimately on those reason codes, because it's not consumer friendly. It's just one of those quirky little federal laws that are out there. So 740, that is the goal. Now, as far as the credit score and breaking down what comes together to give us a score, the most important thing is paying things on time, avoiding 30-day lates. 30-day late payments are going to have the worst impact on the credit report in the immediate time. So if I can avoid 30-day late payments, that's ideal. As I mentioned earlier, those will only be there for 7 years, but once it's actually 30 days late, that's when it actually reports to the credit bureau. So I could be 10 days late, incur a late fee, and it's still not reporting on my credit report necessarily. And most student loans, well, at least the government-backed student loans, they a lot of times won't report until it actually hits 60 days. But then they'll report the 30 and the 60 days. So that's kind of the questionable thing there in terms of it reports it all at once. And here's an important thing to know about government-backed student loans, since I see them so often on credit reports. Each semester or quarter, depending what that school's academic calendar was, most commonly semester, each semester that student loan that was dispersed is its own loan. So if I'm in school for, let's say, 8 semesters, I would have 8 different student loans on my credit report. And let's say that they're each $50. So whatever my total is, whatever all my student loans that are under, let's say it's Navient or Mohila or directly to the Department of Education, which I think Mohila has taken over all that, whatever my total is that I owe to that particular student loan servicer, when I pay that, if I'm paying them $500, well, if I've got 10 loans that each have $50 owed, that's being dispersed to each individual loan. So if I'm late, if I hit that 60 days and now they're reporting a 30 and a 60-day late, I'm getting hit like 10 times. It can destroy my credit report. So it's very important for students, especially when they're coming out of college and getting into the workforce, to make sure they're communicating. And if they need to get into an income-based repayment plan, they need to do that. Or if they need to get into some sort of a forbearance so that they're deferring their student loans, communicate and do everything that's available to them so that way they aren't getting those late payments, because it's almost like a nuclear bomb going off on the credit score when that happens, because it's multiples. It's not just one payment. In our mind, mentally, it's one payment, but it could be to 8 to 10 more or less. We're getting hit multiple times, and that's something people need to realize, especially young people, because they never taught us about that when I was in school. Although they're doing more of that these days, but probably not as much as they should. The second most important thing is balances. 30% of our FICO score is going to be based on the balances. It's the credit utilization ratio. Ideally, if I have a credit card, let's say I have a $10,000 credit limit, I want to just keep that balance as low as possible. 0 is fine. If I'm at 0 balance, that's fine. Now, I want to make sure I use that credit card probably at least once a year to make sure I don't lose it due to inactivity, but I don't want to have a $9,950 balance going into applying for a mortgage if I can help it, because now it's kind of like going to the beach. I can work out really, really hard for 6 months in advance and try to look my best in my swimsuit. I can not do any of that and I can still go to the beach. I'm just maybe not going to be as comfortable as I would have been if I had worked out for 6 months prior and stayed out of the McDonald's drive-thru. So it's kind of the same thing. I could have those balances on my credit card and still be approved for a mortgage. It's just if I have the extra funds to where I could pay, if I'm looking for a way to improve myself, it's kind of the whole concept of having a cleaning person come to your house. What happens the night before somebody has the cleaning person come to their house? what happens?
You clean your room.
You clean everything, right?
everything.
So it's like you're paying somebody to then motivate you to clean your place. So it's kind of the same thing when it comes to going to get a car, get a mortgage. People want their credit to look as good as it possibly can. But in some situations, it would be better to leave the credit exactly the way it is, and hold on to that money, because any reserves, any money that they have in reserves that they don't need for that transaction, they don't need it for the down payment, they don't need it for their closing costs, whatever money that's going to be left over, we call that reserves. Reserves, if I've got 12 months reserves of my mortgage payment and the automated underwriting is picking that up, it might approve somebody at a lower FICO score that they wouldn't approve that if they didn't have those reserves. So it's almost a better idea to have a lender run it through to see, should I pay the credit cards down, or am I fine exactly the way I am? I see a lot of people spend time trying to make it better when they actually were fine the way they were. Or they try to make it better, but they actually would have benefited more from having the money, because cash is always king. They would have been better having the money in the bank than paying down the credit cards. So that's something to think about, but try to keep those credit card balances low. And then the third one is 15%. And if you're looking at the handout on page 3 here, number 3 is the length of history is 15%, and that comes down to how long have I had credit. That's where we want to make sure that our credit cards aren't closed down, because even if I have a zero balance on my credit card, I still get credit for it being open and I'm paid as agreed. It's just the amount due is zero. So I still get a paid as agreed. On the credit report, you get a little 1 each month that goes by that you pay as agreed. If I don't know anything, I get my little 1. And so I'm getting credit on that 35%. If I keep the balance low or at zero, I'm getting 30% there. And then that 15%, I mean, you can add that all together, and what we're at 80% of our credit score can really be maintained by just keeping open zero balance credit cards that we use enough, at least once a year, so they don't close due to inactivity, and people can be in pretty good shape just doing that. So length of history is important. And let's see here, 10% is new credit and inquiries. The biggest question that comes up, hey, do I need to worry about going to multiple lenders for a mortgage and have them pull my credit report? As long as it's happening within about a 30 to 45 day time frame, it's not a big deal if they go to multiple mortgage companies. Just keep in mind, you can always get information regarding who you're going to use before your credit's actually pulled. That is a possibility. I mean, granted, some things are going to be matched up to the actual FICO score, but you can get a good feel for who you're going to use prior to the credit actually being pulled. Type of credit, 10%, and that's going to be the difference between secured, unsecured, revolving, installment, different types of credit. It doesn't have as much of an impact. If somebody has all credit cards, is that a big deal? Really not. It's going to say it in that reason code, oh, you only have revolving lines of credit. That's not really that big of a deal. And from the standpoint of somebody having, let's say they only have an installment loan, let's say they only have a car payment. Well, what happens when they pay that car off? They don't have an installment payment anymore. Now, each month that goes by, if they don't go out and get another installment loan, they're not going to get that history. And that's the thing that people need to consider is long-term, that indefinite nature of the revolving accounts, whether it's a department store card, a major credit card, it really will make a difference in the long term. Okay, so that is the breakdown of the FICO score. So disputing accounts, I mentioned earlier that if somebody disputes an account on their credit report, then it can result in major issues. Well, that major issue is this. If they dispute something that is accurate, and let's assume that it's non-medical, that will actually void their automated underwriting findings. And so when that happens, they will have to go manual underwrite. And what that means is, instead of going off what the computer says you need for that loan to be approved, you have to just get everything. So if I have automated underwriting findings that don't ask for the taxes, don't ask for a verification of rent, I don't have to have that in the file. But if I don't have an automated underwriting finding to go off of, now I just have to get everything. So now I just automatically have to get the taxes. I automatically just have to do the verification of rent. And that's what people don't realize is that disputing things that actually are true is generally just not advisable. It's just not a good thing. Now, sometimes people have disputes on their credit reports and they didn't initiate anything. So one of the things I tell my clients is don't call any of your creditors about anything unnecessarily during this process of when we have started until we are recorded, because even just picking up the phone and making a pretty nonchalant phone call could accidentally result in an account showing as being in dispute. I see that happen a lot. A lot of times, I would say probably more than 50% of the time, when there's a dispute on a credit, on a trade line, on a credit report, the consumer is absolutely surprised. It's a surprise to them. And so they're like, I didn't dispute that. I didn't do anything. I didn't pay a credit repair place to go dispute everything. I didn't do anything of that along those lines. Well, what happens is they call and they ask a question, and if there's any potential like disagreement at all, then that creditor may just automatically put it as in dispute. And since that voids our automated findings, that's a very important thing. So, if I was a listing agent or a buyer's agent, I probably would ask a question at the beginning, hey, were there any disputes on the credit? This will make you look really smart. Were there any disputes on the credit report that we should be concerned about with the automated underwriting? So now you're killing two birds with one stone. Did they review the entire credit report? And number two, did they actually run it through automated underwriting? So, but those two things go together. I could have an approval in automated underwriting. I could, for example, on FHA, you can go up to, it's like 56% on the back end debt to income ratio, potentially. I can't on a manual underwrite. On a manual underwrite, I'm probably going to be capped at 45%. So I can be approved for more potentially on an automated underwriting finding versus what I'm going to get on a manual underwriting. And so this is extremely significant. So if you've ever had a transaction where all of a sudden somebody is no longer approved for what they were approved for previously, it may be an issue of, oh, there was a dispute on the credit report that voided the automated underwriting findings, and so what they were approved for previously doesn't matter anymore because now they have to be manually approved because that existed. So do you see how catching these things early is very important? I mean, my checklist, it's got like 12 pages. I have a 12-page checklist just as before a pre-qualification form can go out. There's just so many little things, and I'm not perfect. It's kind of like every month it seems like I'm adding something new because there's just so many different variables of things that can happen. And so that's one thing, is we'll never get bored in this industry because there's always new things that we need to be aware of. But I mean, this has been around for a while. It's one of those things, just little detail. If somebody's disputed medical collection, doesn't matter. We don't care. Nobody cares about the medical. It's non-medical. That's it's a non-medical with a balance. And in the handout, I actually put the FHA guideline in there on the last page, page 4. It talks more about that. I'm going a little too fast on that screen, but if you go down and look in the middle of page 4 in the handout, the FHA guideline is disputed charge-off accounts, which are generally credit cards. Once a credit card becomes 6 months delinquent, it gets charged off. It's an accounting notation. It's still due. It's just being sent to collection. So if that's being disputed, then that could void the approval unless it's a zero charge-off. If it's been satisfied, if it's been paid off, if it's been settled, that's fine. Or if it's been over 7 years and it shouldn't be there in the first place. Any collection accounts, and then the other one is any disputed accounts that have had a late payment in the past 24 months. If that shows up, in the last 24 months, if that shows up as in dispute, once again, we're voiding our automated findings. And so it's really important to make sure that this is addressed. Like, this is a very much at the beginning type of thing to make sure, even before you get a pre-qualification form, that this person's in good shape. Sometimes I'll get a call on a Saturday morning, hey, this person's good to go. Can you just take 5 minutes to make sure they're good and issue the pre-qualification? It's like, I can't get through a 12-page checklist in 5 minutes, to really thoroughly look at it the way it needs to be looked at. I mean, I could probably do it in 10, but maybe not 5. So, but there's a lot of little moving parts here that if we want to make sure that we're going to not have a problem, we need to look at it like an underwriter at the beginning so that there's not a problem. And that's the key thing there. So the exclusion is if it's less than $1,000. This is on FHA. If it's less than $1,000 that's being disputed on FHA that are non-medical, then I don't necessarily have to worry about this. FHA does, it doesn't void the automated approval. It's if it's over $1,000 in non-medical collections. So, and I've seen it where somebody's at $950. I've seen it where they're at $1,050. So if we take a little time and say, okay, well, let's just pay off enough to fall under 1,000, now we can do the automated underwriting and you can get qualified for what you want versus manual where you maybe couldn't get qualified for what you want. And then if they're at $950, you want to make sure that they don't somehow get pushed above that $1,000 mark. At least knowing what the variables of the approval are, that's the most important thing. But we don't care about medical collections. We don't care about anything that arose out of fraud or identity theft. But we do want to have a police report supporting that or a fraud affidavit, something that shows that that is legitimate fraud or ID theft. And then any positive account that's in dispute, it doesn't matter. So the question is, why does this exist? Well, it exists because if you're disputing something and it's in dispute, it doesn't count in your FICO score. So somebody could go in and manipulate their FICO score by just disputing accurate items. Well, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, FHA, VA, USDA, they all know this. And so this is something that's been around. And so it's just really important to realize that inadvertently, because of this, somebody may not have been up to no good in trying to boost their FICO score by just disputing everything, but they might fall into this category where they get affected by it. So that's something to think about. So, and believe me, I could go on for another 30 hours, but I won't, because I know we're at the end. And it's time to do any Q&A.
So, Patrick, tell me about your thoughts on these credit repair companies. Yes or no?
I would say yes to some of them, where they're just doing something that the consumer could potentially do themselves. If they're saying that we're going to dispute things that are inaccurate, that's good. If they say, I would say no to the ones that say we're going to just dispute everything, whether it's accurate or not. Those are the ones that you want to stay away from. So if they're going to just do the work that somebody could do and probably just won't do on their own, that's legitimate. If they're very upfront on what's legitimate and what's not legitimate, if they say, well, we can't just dispute everything and remove it. If they're willing to say that, then they're probably on the up and up.
Okay, so one of our questions says, someone opened a credit fraudulently under my name, and this person will be applying for a mortgage. Is it a good idea to freeze their credit for security reasons and still be able to get the mortgage?
Ooh, good question. I just had that come up recently on one of my transactions, and you have to unfreeze it during the mortgage process. So you do have to completely unfreeze it. I like freezing it from the standpoint of if somebody's out there applying for credit in your name, you want to be able to stop them. And you can. So what freezing does, it's actually a state law in Arizona. I think it was enacted in 2011. You can actually go directly to the credit bureaus through their websites, and you can freeze your credit report so that they're inaccessible. So the other day I'm pulling a credit report and I cannot pull it up. I cannot access it because the borrower, they've frozen their credit report. Well, actually they only froze one. So the other two they froze Equifax but not TransUnion and Expire. And that's the thing, is a credit card company might only use one of those three. They may not use all three, because in the mortgage world we do use all three. Other creditors may not outside of the mortgage world. So if they're going to get a mortgage, I wouldn't freeze it at this point in time. I'd get the fraud affidavit taken care of if it's still in the credit report, the fraudulent credit card. Police report, if necessary, may not be necessary. A lot of times the credit card issuer may be able to just handle it internally, take care of it. If they give you any trouble, then get the police report just so that you have that.
Sounds good. All right, and then our next question is, being a new young person starting credit, is it better to leave a small amount of money on his credit card via paying them off every month?
I get asked that question a lot, especially when I teach at ASU. I get asked that a lot. And so the answer is it probably doesn't matter. Even my own credit report issuer keeps telling me that it does matter. I've researched this enough. I have not seen where it actually matters. Maybe in the very, very, very beginning. But my unscientific research has not indicated that it really matters to carry a small balance. And if it does, it really must not matter past the first 6 months if you're brand new, absolutely brand new to credit. Because as I said earlier, even if you have a zero balance, a zero balance is still going to get that little 1 to show that you paid as agreed, even if 0 is the amount that was due. And so you don't have to do anything. You still get your 1. So, I mean, activity is good, especially early on. So maybe doing, at least having the activity. But I have not for actually a new book I've been working on, I have not seen that actually be true physically based on what I'm seeing. So I would say maybe it's a do it and don't worry about it, but it's probably not going to make much of a difference.
Okay, so the next question is, what is a good source to find an accurate FICO score for a nominal fee?
I would say myfico.com. Yeah, it's not cheap. Cheap, we're used to free, right? But you're probably going to spend 20, 38 bucks. Every once in a while they'll do a little like 15-day trial that's free. Just remember to cancel it if you don't want it, something like that. But they probably are the best source. Or unless you have a credit card that's given the FICO scores, those seem to be pretty close to the actual FICO.
So myfico.com.
Myfico.com.
Okay. So is it true if someone pings your credit, but you open up a line of credit with them, it won't take any points off your credit?
If you open up a new account, it's going to do something. It's a very small portion. I wouldn't worry too much about how many points I'm going to lose from having a new account, because if 10% of the FICO score is applying for new credit and getting new credit, we can slice that in half, as 5% is the inquiry, 5% is actually getting the new credit. It's such a small amount. If 100% gets me an A+ on an exam, well, if I lose 5% of that, 95% is still an A. So, and that's kind of the equation that we have the FICO score. I wouldn't be too worried about it. I would only be worried if I was applying for, maybe two or three credit cards in the same time, and a car and a mortgage. Then I'd probably be more concerned.
Okay, so what can a car cosigner do about clearing a report when the car has been repossessed?
Keep in mind, if you signed on that dotted line and agreed, and I see this way more than I should, but I see this a lot. People they co-sign on it, it gets repossessed. Review the note, see what the terms were, but if it gets repossessed, most likely somebody's on the hook for taking over, paying that. That's the whole point of co-signing. If I'm lending and I say, hey, you need a co-signer, and they get one, the reason is because I don't think this person's going to pay, so I want somebody else that I can go after, and that's exactly what it sounds like has occurred. So if the car has not been repossessed, do your best to kind of work with what you have. If it's already been repossessed and it's reporting as such, most likely it'll just have to run its course. It'll fall off after 7 years. They're going to sell the car and whatever is remaining on the loan, tack on the repo fee, and then they'll say that's owed. I don't see them sue on that debt very often. They potentially could. If somebody's ever sued, they needed to show up in court. That's the most important thing. At least be there. And but unfortunately, that they probably are on the hook from that limited information.
And you talked a little bit about people with 740s and 841s. Let's talk a little bit, Patrick, about the people who they don't have the high scores. Maybe they have a 600 score or a 550 score. What do you tell them? Where do you start with them?
Let's say somebody's at 550. Our goal is going to be to get to at least 620. If they want a down payment assistance program like the Home in 5, our goal is going to be 640. If we can get to 640, ideally 640, if we can get there, but if we can get to at least 630 and they have their own money, or they can get a gift from a relative for their down payment, and that's for FHA. Conventional FHA will go down to 580. That's the actual FHA guideline is 580 with 3.5% down. Conventional Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they'll go down to 620 for the FICO score. But if I can at least get to 620, I probably can do something. If I can get to 630, I'm better than 620. But if I can at least get to 640, that's ideal. In a dark world, it's the ideal in a world with electricity. That's the candle. So if I can get to 640, I'm at least in the game. And on FHA, the rate isn't going to be that much different for somebody at a 640 versus being at, say, 680. There's a difference, but it's not as noticeable as on conventional. People with lower FICO scores get hammered a lot harder on conventional than they would on FHA or VA. But make the goal. If I'm trying to get from the 500s, make the goal, get to 640. If I can get to 640, I have a lot more options.
Okay. So this is going to be a 5-part question.
Okay.
So I'm looking for 5 steps.
Okay.
The people who are on today's webinar are realtors, and of course, we're all in this together. The relationship between the realtor and the lender, extremely important. If all these realtors, they have websites, and you mentioned that the consumers, they're out, they're looking for homes, they're pulling their own credit reports, they're a little bit more savvy than they used to be. So I'm a realtor, I have a website. What do I put on my website that would start the ball rolling or help the consumer think about their credit in this way? So what are 5 proactive things I can tell the consumer about the financial aspect of getting a loan?
Okay. Well, first thing I would do, I would plant the seed that they need to speak to a loan officer to see where they stand today. And here's the thing. I could go to any credit report website on the internet, get my credit report, and look at it, but do I really know what I'm looking at? I can also go to Los Angeles on vacation, and you can put me in Los Angeles. I'm in Los Angeles, but I don't know where I'm going, and I need a guide. And so that I see that a lot where people they think, okay, well, I got my credit report. So, okay, am I a success in life because I woke up this morning? I woke up this morning, but did I do anything? So if I have my credit report, do I know what I'm looking at? What are the next steps? So I think they need guidance. I think that's what's missing is guidance. So if they can go talk to a loan officer and get some guidance of where do I qualify as it stands right now? Determine that. If I want to buy, let's find out, do I qualify for what I want right now? If not, what do I need to do to get there? It might be I need to save up some money so I have some reserves. It might be I need to pay off some credit cards, or I need to call my student loans and see if I can work with them to get these get things situated. Sometimes it's just a matter of getting things situated. A lot of times people are surprised when they look at their credit report and they're like, I don't know what that is. It can be confusing, and you look at it. If you change up the format of a credit report, I get all flustered because I get so used to a certain format, and so consumers are getting all sorts of different formats. And I've written 3 books on credit, and I've been teaching about credit for years, and the whole finance thing. And if you change up the format for me, I still know all the important information, but the format change will freak me out. And so I can't imagine as a consumer them looking at it and not knowing what everything means and how confusing it can be. So I'd say that's the first step. And then the second thing would be to realize that what they're seeing may not be 100% completely accurate. It may be missing some things, like the example of the foreclosure and the bankruptcy missing from that consumer's report and being told, hey, congratulations, you have no public records. Thirdly, I would say they need to realize that the credit score that they're being given may not actually be the one that the lender is going to pull. And then it'll help alleviate the disappointment. Unfortunately, I have to be the bearer of that bad news many times because they're like, oh, somebody say, I have my scores at 950. And they're like, well, you probably, if you have a 950 on one of those generic models, you probably have like a 850, probably more like an 800, maybe 780 on the FICO model. But, getting into, I can go to the moon where I only weigh 75 pounds and feel pretty good about myself, but I don't go to the moon. I'm here on Earth, and here on Earth I weigh like 200 pounds. Yeah, so it's like I can have a broken scale that tells me I weigh 180, which is my ideal weight, and I go to the doctor, and the doctor says, Patrick, you weigh 215. Yeah, so I get the truth when I go to the doctor. It's all lies in my bathroom, on the scale in the bathroom. So it's kind of the same idea here, that it's disappointing when they see, oh, my score is not as high as I thought it was. But the reality is it may not matter. At the end of the day, there's one thing that matters, and that's, can I get the mortgage at what I can afford on a monthly basis? That's the goal. That's the end game. And, scores are nice, but that's the fluff. It's less important than people realize. At the end of the day, it's, can I get approved? Can I get the keys to a home? And then the fifth one, I would say, get all of your documentation together, W-2s, taxes, past 2 months bank statements, past 2 pay stubs or 30 days worth of pay stubs, driver's license, get that stuff together so that you have it readily available. If somebody gives me everything I ask for and then they sign everything I send to them, the process is super easy. The problem is when people don't get stuff back or they miss, like there's a form called the 4506T for the tax transcript. My instructions, if people just read the instructions, I would say that's the thing I would tell to every consumer and every agent to tell to their clients is read the instructions. So if the instructions say check the box above your signature and you don't check it, then it's got to be sent back to you to then check that box. If it says write in your phone number and you don't write it. It's little things like that because it's a detailed process. Because at the end of the day, it's a lot of money being lent, and there's a lot of federal regulation involved, and so there's a lot of I's to dot and T's to cross. So.
Absolutely. Okay, and can you get an FHA loan if you have another home that is used as a rental, and this one will be your primary?
Assuming that the one's currently FHA is being rented, it would depend. Generally, the answer is no. You can only have one FHA loan at a time. However, there are exceptions if that house was awarded to an ex-spouse that you had jointly got that on, if you had moved from one city to another, like talking major move, like another state to another state, maybe in that situation. When somebody has that circumstance, you really have to look at why. If it's just the luxury of renting it out and keeping the financing in place, the answer is probably no, they wouldn't be allowed to do that. But if it's something that meets the requirements of what the exceptions are for FHA. Let's say you co-signed as a non-occupant co-signer for your kid while they were in college. That you hear the term, that kiddie condo program, which actually isn't a real program as much as it's just a parent can co-sign for their child who doesn't have a job. I had somebody recently where the child is out of college but doesn't have a job and can't show any income. Dad stepped in, qualified based on his income. He's not going to live there. He's just a non-occupant co-signer. So he's on that FHA loan. If she later moves out and they rent that out and he wanted to go get an FHA loan in his name for his primary, he probably could do that, even though that's being rented out, because he never was going to occupy that as his primary residence. So it's definitely situational.
So what's the difference between a second home loan and an investor loan? And can a second home be in the same state?
A second home can be in the same state. You could buy, as a general rule, 50 miles from your primary residence. You're going to occupy it 2 weeks out of the year. So if you live in, let's say you live in Mesa, for example, I know the mileage, so I'll use it as an example. If you're in Mesa and you want to buy something in Payson, it's just about 50 miles. It might actually be a little less than 50 miles, but the geographic difference and the weather difference, the cooler weather, it makes sense. So it has to make sense first and foremost. I can't say I live in far East Mesa and I want to buy a house in West Buckeye, all the way across Maricopa County. So that just doesn't really make sense for a second home. So it's got to make sense as first and foremost.
Have you ever driven that?
I have.
Mesa to Buckeye? I would consider that a second home.
But it has to make sense. It has to make. There could be a reason. Maybe I go camping. I don't know. There would have to be a reason, and that's the main thing to avoid fraud. Because if I buy it as a second home, I am not allowed to rent that out. I cannot rent that out. And so it all boils down to read the deed of trust. What does the deed of trust say? The deed of trust, when I'm signing that, the deed of trust on a primary residence says I'm going to occupy this for 12 months as my primary residence. After 12 months, I bought it as a primary, I could rent it out because I've abided by the agreement in the deed of trust, what the verbiage says. If it's a second home, it says I'm not going to rent this out. And people need to be aware of that. If I buy it as an investment property, it says I'm not going to live in it, for more than, because of ability to repay. You actually want to make sure that somebody's really going to rent it out and not just live in it themselves. I mean, they could later on, I suppose, but always refer back to the verbiage of the deed of trust. Remember that on a second home, if you plan on renting it out, that is a problem, most likely, because it's kind of one of those things where it wasn't always enforced. Let's say that the school zone speed limit is 35, but the police officer with the radar let people go 41. Anybody over 41 gave a ticket. Well, it was never really looked at by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. As long as the mortgage was paid, that would suffice. But now they're looking at it if they happen to audit that and they see that somebody has listed that on Trulia, Zillow, Craigslist, and they see that address come up as a rental, they may call the loan. And I've heard of that happening, and then they'll be forced to refinance it into an investment property. And if they can't qualify, then they will have to probably sell the home. So
what if you own your primary residence free and clear and are going to purchase a second home?
Sounds like it should be pretty easy. I mean, as long as it fits the parameters of what a second home is, a place that's truly going to be a second home. I mean, and that's what it's supposed to be. Even though I may only have to be there 2 weeks out of the year, most people probably are there more. It shouldn't be a problem. It's all about, does it make sense? Does it make sense? I can't buy a second home in my same neighborhood. There just doesn't really make sense. Now, I could just say I'm going to rent out my current primary residence and I'm going to buy a new primary residence. Let's say that my kids are out of the house. I see this a lot. Kids are out of the house. I don't need 3,000 square feet anymore. I only need 1,500 square feet. So now I'm going to rent out my primary, and now I'm going to go buy a new primary. It makes sense. I'm downsizing. My reason is because my kids are out of the house. I don't need that much space anymore. Or maybe I'm in a 1,500 square foot home and I'm getting married and we both bring 3 kids, like kind of the Brady Bunch, if anybody remembers the Brady Bunch show. Now I'm going to have 6 kids and 2 adults. Well, 3,000 square feet might be more space needed for a larger family. So if it makes sense, then it's generally fine. So
when you mentioned renting out a home, does that include like the new Airbnb type things?
Generally, no, because those are short term. You're talking generally that you're writing a contract or a lease for 12 months or longer. Okay. VA actually doesn't require that you even provide the lease. You just have to have your agent kind of draw what their likely rent would be, or an appraiser can do it as well. And you don't actually have the lease in hand. So I see that a lot where people want to do some work on it before they lease it out, but in other situations, generally they need to have a lease in place. But if they don't need it to qualify, they can just state what their intent is, and then if they don't need it to qualify, then it probably doesn't matter at that point.
So as long as the primary home is paid off and about 50 miles away, a borrower could get a second home loan, and a second home loan interest rate less than an average investor loan?
Yeah, second homes are generally the same exact rates as primary residences, which is the attraction to buying it as a second home and then renting it out, but which we can't do because then we'd be in breach of the deed of trust and the note could be called. But that's the attraction to doing it that way. So.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick. Patrick, what's the best way for our members to get in contact with you?
Best way, you can email me at patrick.ritchie@outlook.com or patrick.ritchie@caliberhomeloans.com. And if anybody wants more information, I have some very interesting finance workbooks. My hobby is writing, and I've got some finance workbooks that are pretty detailed, and I think that they would find them useful.
And tell us the name of the books that you have written. Are they available on Amazon?
They are the Credit Roadmap, which will actually, a new one will be hitting Amazon's digital shelves probably in 60 days. Excellent. And then there'll be 2 more releases probably in the next 90 days. And I've got there's a lot going on. There's going to be an onslaught of things hitting Amazon very soon.
Excellent. So The Credit Roadmap.
The Credit Roadmap.
By Patrick Ritchie.
Yep.
I know that we have copies of this. My kids have copies of that book as well. Being college students, they need to be aware of this. You need to be proactive.
And if somebody needs a copy, they can always email me. I usually have copies at my office. Can swing by and pick one up. So.
Absolutely. And your office is in which city?
Scottsdale, and we've also got a location in Chandler.
So there, you heard him say it. If you would like more information on what we talked about today, or you'd like a copy of The Credit Roadmap, reach out to Patrick, and that's very, very generous of you. Thank you very much. And on your screen, you'll see our upcoming webinars next week, or in about, I guess, 2 weeks. We're going to talk about 5 myths every realtor needs to know about VA loans. Doesn't that sound exciting?
And Jimmy's a good instructor, so I'll have to listen on that. I like Jimmy a lot.
Excellent. Ken's very highly recommended. And then coming up on October 12th, we have property management with disclosure issues every property manager needs to know or should know, and this is with attorney and Judge Denise Holliday. And then October 20th, we're going to talk about Make It Rain and Where to Find Business with Liz Recchia. And we're excited about this. We talked about this before, that what you do today kind of impacts your business in 90 days. So we're going to talk about how to kick off your business or build your business in the new year. So we were thrilled. Some really good webinars coming up. So folks, thank you so very much for joining us today. Patrick, thank you.
Thank you.
I think we should put together a series.
Sounds good.
I think we've got a ton of information here that it would be good to have proactively.
Yeah, absolutely.
And maybe the top 10 things realtors need to know.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, folks, and we hope you have a wonderful day. And remember to reach out to Patrick and stop by his office and pick up a copy of his book. Thank you very much, and have a great day.